You're going to record it too, right? Four. Welcome. Should I start? Wait, one more minute. We'll wait. We will start in a few minutes. Just please hold on. Oh.
Students are present, we put our masks on.
Oh.
If you want to stay,
Yeah.
if we actually had questions for anyone,
Yeah.
they could come up and speak.
Okay.
Like, just
Yeah. Okay, it's 7:01, so good evening. We're going to go ahead and start this community meeting on the election by area. This is our community meeting, I believe, our fourth and final one before we have two more board meetings that are upcoming regarding this matter. So we are coming live and in person from Hearst Elementary School. So we're excited about that. And we do have both the Zoom and live attendance here at Hearst. So with that, I'm going to make a few introductions. We have on Zoom David Cates, and he is with Davis Demographics, and he's been shepherding this process along with William Tunick of DWK, who is also with us. And I am Ahmed Shighoslami. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services. And we do have a few of our staff members here as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, David, to show the presentation. So tonight, again, this very similar meeting format. We're going to go through where we are with the maps at this time. And we are now down to 3 existing and a 5th new one. So you will not see scenario option number 1 based on board direction. That one has now been removed. And so we're going to kind of, we know that different people are looking at this at different times. So we are going to cover the maps that we have presented in the past. And then we'll do a little bit deeper dive on map number 5. And we have received some community input. And so we'll kind of go over some of the inputs that we've received and what we've tried to do to address those. And then lastly, we'll open it up for any questions or comments from either our Zoom or audience members here at Hearst Elementary School. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to you, David, so you can run through the presentation.
Thank you, Ahmad. Hi, David Cates, Davis Demographics, going to walk you through probably something a lot of you have already seen before, but forgive us, there's going to be new people seeing this for the first time. So I kind of want to run through the basics of what we've been doing for the last 5+ months. The purpose of this is to generate 5 unique trustee boundary areas. We're trying to balance the population based on the 2020 census. The overall population within the district boundaries is a little over 81,000 people. And I'm emphasizing people, it doesn't matter what age group. We're looking at all ages of people from 0 to over 100. The goal is to do as close as we can a balancing of each of the 5 zones or trustee areas. You can see that the average works out to be A little over 16,200 is our kind of target for each of these areas. And then we have 963 census blocks to kind of move around and group together. And that's what you see on this map. This is color shaded based on number of people per area. And the higher the number in the area, the larger, the darker the color, the lighter, the less. This just was give you just a general overview and showing you the shapes. And we have some very interesting shapes to deal with. Those, again, are the building blocks of the 5 trustee zones. So what I had to do as a demographer was to create scenarios. I think initially I or my company came up with 1 or 2 on our own, and then we've kind of been evolving them from input from the board and the community and from staff. And now we have up to scenario 5 we'll share today. So we use the 2020 census to look at the actual official population counts. A district has to go through this every 10 years. You're going through this the first time now, but in 2030, you will be checking these boundaries with the new census then and rechecking and maybe have to make some adjustments at that time. So we're trying to, our goal is to have an almost equal area of population in each of these 5 areas. There's some variance allowed, which we'll talk about in a moment, but we also want these areas to be contiguous and compact. So we don't want to have some crazy areas that go really long, narrow, north, south, or east, west. We want to kind of make these be as, like I said, compact, like a ball kind of in the perfect situation. But the geography doesn't always happen that way because we look at the next point. We look at the natural boundaries with man-made, like highways, and we can look at rivers and things like that to form, dividing points between some of these areas. I make these maps with only that above criteria first. I balance it out. And then I send the maps and some data to Mr. Tunick, and he reviews it for compliance with the California and Federal Voting Rights Act. And if they are not compliant, I go back and I have to make adjustments. So every map or scenario you see has already been vetted, and they can be adopted by the board if they so choose. Lastly, after the boundaries are made or scenario is made, I then look into what we call the CVAP, or Citizen Voting Age Population. It looks at kind of the last 4 or 5 years, estimates the number of voting age people in each of these zones. And then we break it down, also showing the racial breakdown of those communities as well. And the other layer, if you will, that we used as how we kind of form these boundaries was we presented to the board. And these were some suggestions that the board made to pay a little extra attention to. One of them was looking at how your current attendance zones overlay, elementary, middle, high school, boundaries, how they overlay. And we have maps that show those as well. Also, we have the schools located, and you can see where those are located, but mostly focusing on the boundaries of the schools. We also want to make sure that they're maybe more equally balanced between certain schools, regions in each of these zones. We also, if we knew exactly where a lot of development might happen, that could also play a role, maybe leaving one area a little smaller, if you will, than the others so it can grow in terms of its population. And also the last comment is more like we don't really look at when we're creating the boundaries where some of the incumbent board members live, and we kind of use that as an additional bit of information, but that's not criteria on how we come up with the boundaries. So we're skipping scenario 1. As Ahmad mentioned, it was voted off the list, if you will, by the board in the last board meeting. So we're going to start with 2, 3, and 4, and then introduce 5 to all of you. So just to spend a little bit of time on this one for those of you that are kind of new to the process, this was our second scenario. The color regions represent obviously the 5 trustee areas, and the numbers, the plus green and the minus red, show you what they are above or below the target, which is down there at the bottom, 16,203. you multiply it by 5, you get the 81,000 count of people in the district area. And this is, if everything being equal, we're trying to get it to that level. What we use as our criteria, though, is what we call the maximum variance. And what that means is you take the area that's the most above. In this scenario, it is District 3, and it's up 1.75 above the target. Then you look at the one that's the most below, which is the Trustee Area 1 scenario, 1.56. You add those, essentially the numbers together, and you see it's a 3.31. Our goal is to get it below 10%. So this is definitely in compliance. You're allowed to have areas that are above or below within a certain amount of room, and this definitely complies. And then we have another layer here of information of the subset of the voting age estimated population within each of these 5 areas. So this is scenario 2. The next slide shows the same map, but with a little more breakdown. We have the total population, as I showed in the last screen, but now we can break it down by the different races information here for each of the 5 areas for comparison to each other and to the overall district. So that's one bit of information that we can look at. And then a little bit deeper dive, a subset of that population is the citizen voting age, or CVAP data, where you can see the breakdown of the numbers of people in those areas and the percentages. So we also created tables to show you in this scenario, Area 1 has parts of Donelson, Hearst, and Leidixson. Area District 2 has parts of Alisal, Donelson, and Fairlands. So it's not saying that they're all within there, because you can see Donelson's in 3 different areas, but some of them are exclusively in them, but most of them touch good portions of them. And you can see how the breakdown of your middle schools and the high schools based on the boundaries. So this is just a quick way for you to get an idea on how they are distributed among the proposed areas. And then we also have maps to show you the physical outlines of your existing elementary boundaries as they are today and how they overlay on this scenario. So if you want to look at this, this is area 4. It has all of Moore in there, most of Alisal, maybe half of Valley View, or not half of this portion of Valley View. And then, a little tiny bit, or it dips down here. So that's the area. Whereas the purple area, District 5, has mostly or parts of Hearst, a little bit of Valley View, pretty much all Vintage Hills, and a good portion of Valley View. So that's the way to kind of look at these. We have your middle school boundaries. You can see how the 3 zones overlay on each of these scenarios. And we have your high school zones with the 2 option areas as well. So these might be important to you as you look at each scenario, and it might be helpful to the board and when they make their decisions on which scenario they favor. So let's look at scenario 3 briefly here. Basically, the little different formations, but now area 3 is the lowest area, and the area of, let's say, it looks like pretty close, 4 and 1 are pretty similar above. The maximum variance is a little higher. The other one was around 3. This is around 7. Still acceptable to the law. It's below 10%. So these are acceptable. And the CVAP numbers for the subsets of these numbers as well. This is the population, same population numbers, but now you can see how it breaks down by the different races on here for each of the 5 areas. And then just like before, the subset of the citizen voting age population and the racial breakdowns for that as well. Here's a breakdown scenario 3 with how each of them touches different parts of the boundaries. Don't get so fixated on where the schools are located. This is an important lesson for you to look at where the outlines are. That, each area might only have 1 or 2 schools, but they might touch 3 or 4, maybe even 5 boundaries. So that it's not so much where the school's located, but how far reaching the boundary is. So there was the elementary, this is the middle of scenario 3, and these are the high schools. All right, and now this is scenario 4. Same idea, we're just, shifting around. This particular scenario was suggested by some of the board members to look into because they wanted each of the 5 areas to touch each of the 2 high school zones. So the shapes might look a little different, but you'll see in a moment why we made these boundaries the way they are. It is compliant. It's even less than 5% here, plus or minus. Still very well balanced. And here's the population counts with the racial breakdowns on scenario 4, along with the citizen voting age population for that scenario as well. Here's the breakdown by each of the areas. And if you notice, they all have Amador Foothill. So they all, if you go back to the other scenarios, some had maybe just one. So I'll show you in a moment how that kind of overlays and it'll make more sense to you, but this is what the elementary overlay is for each of these zones. Little bit of, you can see even here it dips down into more. One of the differences. This is the middle school overlay. And this is the high school overlay. So just to kind of now see it a little differently, that's why we grabbed this area out here. It dips down and takes part of Foothill. So even though the area is mostly Amador, it does have part of Foothill. And these other areas, the blue, mostly Amador, but it does reach out to Foothill. And this area here, we also have what we call area 2, dips down and grabs. This is a pretty dense area. It doesn't look like much, but there's a lot of people in here. And that dips down and shares part of the Amador Valley boundary. So they all kind of, and even here, and for District Area 1, we have it reach over into here and grab part of Amador's boundary here. So it's not just the option areas, but it's the parts of the main part of the high school boundaries. So let's share with you for the first time scenario 5. This was a result of some feedback we were getting from the board and the public. So we did even more variation of 4. I know that one of the board members was bringing up, what about if we go all the way down to more for area 2, which didn't work in other capacities, but what we did here was we had to reach up here, grab a portion up here, what was part of 2. It makes it for a very interesting looking boundary, but, and you might look at it and say, yeah, there's only one school in there, but I'll show you in a moment. It has 3 or 4, maybe even 5 boundaries it touches. So don't focus on the school. This is the one with the biggest lesson. You can see that trustee area 4 has the lowest number, and the others, even though I think area 2 is the highest, but it still is within less than 10% compliance, max variance. So it's still acceptable. In these areas, we looked into expanding some areas a little bit more. It's just another variation that could kind of work. We changed some areas down here as well. This is the population percentages with the racial breakdowns for each of the 5 areas. This is the citizens voting age population for each of these areas. This is the breakdown, still pretty well split among the high school boundaries. Most of these do share a couple of middle and high school and elementary boundaries. In fact, that area 4, as I mentioned, I'll go back to in a moment, has actually 5 zones in it. Despite the one school, it has 5 zones in it. So that's important to note. So these are the elementary overlays on scenario 5. And like I said, we did a pretty dramatic change up in this area, and it had a ripple effect for some of the other areas as well. This is the middle school overlay of those same boundaries. And then the high school. Again, they're all touching different parts. The only difference would be that this area 1 really just mostly has the option area, but it's still kind of technically a little part of Amador there too. We had this area go over here, not so much to the freeway, but kind of come down here. It's a little different from some of the other maps as well. And these are the maps side by side. So scenario 1 is here, but it's been removed from consideration. These are the 4 maps here. You could kind of get a better look at them side by side. Some of them have some funny shapes, but keep in mind they're all viable options that the board can adopt, or we can maybe even still build off if we want to explore that way too. But these are, 4 excellent choices. And you can kind of see where the schools land in them as well. And these are those where the school boundaries that they touch. Here they all are side by side. So if you kind of want to get a better idea, like if you just look at across where 4 is, like I said, scenario 5, it touches 5 areas. The others, it touches 4. So you can look at some of the differences between each of these here. Maybe that'll help the board make their decision or easier or whatnot. And we also, it just worked out this way because I told you I did not use this as my criteria when I was creating these maps, but in all 5 scenarios, or all the scenarios we've created, is the same scenario, that there is no current board member living within any of the area 2s. And then you can see the breakdown of where the board members live in terms of these areas. It's the same for all the scenarios. And the way the election cycle works is area 2, obviously no one's there. So for this November, there would be an election for that area for a new board member. And this area, area 5, would be running as well. The other 3 areas would run in 2024. And that would be the full turnover with the new boundaries. It's another way of looking at the same thing I just kind of described. No one's in area 2 that'll be elected. Area 5 will also be, and these others will be, this term ends, board member ends there. But we'll, again, this is kind of the sequence of elections that we're anticipating this year. We have created, there's a dedicated website on the board, on the district's website that you can create or go through and look at. I'll just click on it if you want to kind of see what it looks like. Here it is. We'll have an interactive map I'll show you in a moment. This has been the timeline of the meetings. We have recordings of each of the meetings. There's lots of good information here. The maps are posted with the presentations we're doing. And that's how you have the schedules, interactive map tool. I'll show you that in a moment. And we'll open this up for a Q&A and maybe doing some adjustments as well. And I want to show you the access, this interactive map tool. If you in your leisure at home kind of want to zoom in and look at the maps, it starts with scenario 5, or that's the most recent one. So that's the one that's on the screen. If you zoom in, I'm just scrolling on my mouse. Things will pop up once you get closer. These are in black. These are the census block areas. These are what we cluster to form these boundaries. And the numbers that are on here are the number of people based on the 2020 census that are living in each of these areas. So very small, or this area is 237, but this larger area is 24. So the areas are not always based on density, but you can see if you zoom in closely here, there's some very odd shaped areas, to say the least. Let me move it over. It's like, for some reason, this is a census block, and there's little ones here. There's donut holes and all kinds of weird things in there. If you want to go and look at a different scenario, this is where you can open and close it to look at better. You click on here for the list. You just click it here. So if you go over here, you can change whatever you want. Just uncheck 5, turn on 4. It'll take a bit there real fast. You can look at different overlays if you want. If you want to, as you, like I said, it's a little clustered there. Let's say you want to look here and look at the high school overlays. Here's the high school boundaries. Here's the middle. So you can turn these on and look at them and see how it relates to each of the scenarios. If you want to look at the numbers we have for each of these, and I have scenario 4 open, I come over here, view in a table. At the bottom, it'll tell you for scenario 4 what the population counts are. So if you want to go in, kind of make some suggestions, you just can't go and grab this whole area and say, move this over to here. You're dealing with, you got to do the math and see for every action, there's got to be equal opposite reaction. So if you take away, you got to give. Look how many people live in these areas. It's quite substantial. So it's a challenge coming up with some of these zones, but you just can't, it's hard to just go in and pick an area and say, move it. You might not really fully understand the impact that it has. So I'll let kind of Ahmad jump in here and kind of wrap things up.
Great. Thank you, David. So we're kind of at that point where we're taking final input from the community. We have added an additional meeting in the process. We do have a March 10th board meeting, which will be introducing the map number 5 based on the direction we got. And then based on that final board meeting, we will then have our final public hearing on the 24th, where based on the current maps we propose or any other adjustments we make to another option, they will have to select one, and then that map will be selected, and then we have to submit that to the Alameda County Office of Education for their review and approval. And then from there, it'll go to the county election so that by, the timing can all be done so that for the November election, where we're going to have 2 boundary areas up for election, they can be ready for them. So that's the process that is left with us. We are getting and we have received some different comments from the community. We did receive one student comment map option on the left. We put that up, and so we have looked at that and the balancing of that suggestions we couldn't make work, and I think we can show that. And then there was another suggestion to include Amador not as part of that center area, I think is area number 3. And so, but I think that we achieved creating balance, not by the physical school might be in a boundary, but it's the overall boundary area that counts. And I think we've in different scenarios achieved that comment that's come in. So at this time, what we can do is take first questions from anyone in the audience and any suggestions, and then from there we can, Patrick, open it up to our Zoom audience as well. Okay, so we have one audience member.
I'm an anomaly, I know that.
From there, and then we can repeat the question, or if you'd like to just walk to.
Or I could. Okay, great.
Should I speak from that side?
Yes, I just want to make sure it doesn't fall.
So my first question is, and I know I'm coming late into the game, but this was the first opportunity I had to come. My name is Cynthia Sandu. I'm the PTA president at Donlin. I try to be active with the community and everything. And I live in Valley Trails. And you mentioned a lot of talk about trying to make sure you're touching many different schools with the same area. And I was just wondering if you guys could explain what's the reasoning for that? Because in my mind, I think my school should be represented by a trustee. So if you guys could just explain that further. And then a secondary question is, I do live in Valley Trails, and I noticed that in every single one of these options, I'm being put into the first boundary area, which goes over to the other side of Foothill, which to me doesn't represent my community whatsoever. And so I'm wondering, I'm curious, what is the reasoning to not put people with more of their own community or as opposed to, it just feels very arbitrary to always put Valley Trails, even when Val Vista, which is the neighborhood that we're most closely aligned with, even when Val Vista goes over to the Fairlands side, and I know it's not the Fairlands line, but I just mean, I think it was scenario 3, when they moved over, you see the green area widens up. We're still not included in that. So I'm just wondering how come, I don't know, it feels odd to me that I'm being looped into a group that doesn't feel like represents my community.
Thank you for that input. I think one of the directions, and I think that there's multiple competing kind of criteria here. One of them is to create that compact, that sense of this area kind of makes sense to go together. And there are, kind of, roadways and areas that follows, and you can see that we have tried to incorporate some of that. But I think one of the other criterias was to try to ensure that when the board members are seated, they do represent a cross section of the community. So that sense of that it is still one district and not just a particular area of the district. And so we wanted to make sure that trustee areas have as many of those kind of overarching kind of connections to the different school boundaries as possible. So in the elementaries, we have, I think, achieved that. It becomes harder at the high school level. And so again, you can see that, scenario number 2, which we originally introduced, has a little bit more of that bifurcation in terms of area number 1 is only basically Foothill, and area number 4 is only Amador. And so the other scenarios have tried to kind of reduce that and create that kind of a spread. But I think that's a valid input. Can we go back to the maps? I just wanted to better understand the area that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of like that horseshoe neighborhood.
If you could show it to me, is
Where this, it's kind of hard to see, this little horseshoe.
okay.
And you always dip out and grab us
Okay.
in
I
every
see.
single one,
Okay.
always into the pink area. Whereas this neighborhood right here, they get broken off at some point, and we're super tied to that neighborhood. Like so it's just weird that they can get broken out in one scenario, but we never get broken out in a different opportunity of being part of, I don't know, what feels more like our side of town. Like you said, there is a freeway here. It feels very separated, and we're always getting thrown to the other side.
Okay.
The only thing I would add to what Mr. Sheiko Salami said was that the direction from the board of can you go to the priority slide, the criteria slide, whoever's controlling the presentation? There were some guide rules that we were working with. Sorry, just for, yeah, first. There we go. And you can see in the bullets, top 2 bullets in particular, there was a desire to distribute secondary schools evenly across the trustee areas, and the same thing for the elementary schools. And the reasoning for that was because they wanted each board member to have some investment in each of the schools, or the widest swath of the schools that are possible. And so that one board member I'm a Foothill board member, or I'm an Amador board member. It's easier with the elementary schools because there's more of them. And so it really was to try to ensure that all 5 board members had investment in all of the decisions that we're making as a district. So that was the goal of it. And it took us a while to get to a place where we actually had that spread at the high school level.
Just coming from a feel of being in one of the starter neighborhoods of Pleasanton, to be connected with one of the most expensive areas of town feels a little questionable, because I feel like, well, that's where our board member will come from, not from my neighborhood, because that's where the ties are, right?
in the particular maps during this election cycle, that may or may not be true depending on where a current trustee is living. But if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about running for the school board because we're always looking for good candidates.
It's not the first time I've heard that.
So anyways, that was the rationale. I hope that answered your question.
Any other questions from anyone from the audience or comments? Okay. Patrick, if you can help me and open it up to see if there's any raised hands in our audience members. If anyone has a question, if they could raise their hand.
Yeah, so if anyone in our virtual audience would like to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to raise your hand, and we can certainly allow you to speak.
No raised hands online.
Okay, Ahmad, if you want, I can show a little demonstration of why one of those suggestions didn't work. If you want me to show you that behind the scenes a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll check back with the audience and if there's any final questions, and then we can talk about next steps.
Yeah, so let's go back to a couple of the map suggestions. I think this one might have come from the student board member, if I remember correctly. And they were asking about using scenario 1, which we've eliminated, but I still created a scenario off of this. They were wanting to just kind of grab this area, add it to 4, and some areas here add it to 2 or bring it down. So what I did, this is the software. This is the tools that I use to generate those maps and the numbers. And so I essentially took what was scenario 1 and I kind of tried moving some things around. Remember, these are what we are stuck with. These are not streets. You might be able to see your street network in here. These are the outlines of the census block. So this is all I can move around. And so I think we're talking about grabbing some of this area and adding it to 4 and adding some of this area. There was an apartment complex, which is actually right here. That's already part of 2. So that was already in there. And then this might be hard to see, but these are the numbers on this variation. And the first thing that pops out of my notice here is by making these adjustments, now the plan is way out of acceptance. It's the high and the low number you mentioned, you add them together. This is over 27% variance. So what happens is 4, by making that change, bringing all this area in, is now way above. It's actually 2,332 above the target, which makes it by itself out of compliance. Plus district area 1, even in this scenario, was too far over. So we had to, still would have to work on and this is too low, I should say, too far below. So we'd have to bring in a ripple effect, bringing more across here or here. This is a scenario that would need to be really retweaked, but right off the bat with those suggestions, it really threw it out of whack and would not be acceptable in that format that they showed. It doesn't mean it's not a good starting point, because that's how all these scenarios work. You start with a suggestion, it doesn't work, and then you say, okay, well, what if we take this and we add it to 3, and we take this and add it to 1? That's kind of how it works. So this is kind of the tool behind there. The other, I want to make sure I address, I think we did, but just this other person that suggested, carving this area out, because take Amador Valley out of this area. Remember, as I said before, I think this is scenario 4. So if I go back to scenario 4, this is what I would suggest you all do, in your free time, go back to the website and look at these maps and these scenarios. This is for overlaid with the high school boundaries. Okay, even though, you know, Amador is physically here, this is the overall Amador boundary. You can see how it overlays with that picture, the zone they had. You got the middle school boundaries for the same school 4 and 1. So again, I put the schools on there, but remember, really focus on the outline of the boundaries for there. That's really the main criteria. So I just want to make sure that I addressed those two submissions this last week or two.
Thank you, David, for that clarification. So at this point, again, if we have any raised hands in the Zoom, you can ask your final question or provide your final comment. We'll wait for that. Any additional okay, comment on question, one question.
When you looked at all these scenarios, getting to your question, is there a couple of scenarios that have just one section of the school, or some of the scenarios have more than one section of the school?
So yeah, so if we go back to the if you can go back to the summary one, I believe it, yeah, this one. So on the elementary schools, because the elementary boundaries are a little smaller, you can see how many in each scenario, how many. So again, I would say scenario number 4 and scenario number 5 have a very good representation in each of them. I think we have maybe 4 schools. The smallest one is 2, which has 3 schools. Area number 3 in scenario 5 even has 4 schools. So you can see area 4 has even 5 schools. So on the elementaries, there are kind of that division is created. And then in the middle schools, there is Pleasanton Middle School is kind of represented by one trustee area in a couple of different scenarios, just because of the way it lays out. We weren't able to achieve that, but we were able to achieve it on the high schools on the last 2 scenarios that we worked at. The only item to note is that on the high schools for area number 1, it's the option area that is kind of has Amador and Foothill in it. So again, there are some challenges there.
Well, it looks like each trustee would be touching many different schools. Am I correct in saying that Livingston would generally only have one trustee that touches their school, correct? In any of these scenarios?
That is correct, and I think that the challenge with Leidixon is that it's basically on the one side of 680, and I think it does look like we have a scenario 3 that there's a little bit of a little bit of an overlap. Yeah. So my suggestion is, based on this, again, we'll make sure that this is also linked into the webpage. It is on the board packet, and the maps are also on the website, and the mapping tool is also there. And also within that website is your ability to attach and put your comments and take one of these maps and kind of make some suggestions. We'll do our best to look at those suggestions, and we can bring some of those back, maybe if there's anything to the board meeting that's coming, and then finally to the 24th. So again, I would just say that if you have those further comments, just to get it to us as soon as possible so we can address them, because we are on a timeline to be able to meet the county requirements of submitting them to the county for their review and approval, and then to the county election board for their inclusion for the coming birds.
Any other questions in the room? Yeah, that's okay, I got it. It's so that the people at home can hear.
I was going to ask, if you had a chance to look at the composition of each of these areas in terms of background about, I think the other is based on some census data. So there must be information about the racial composition, about the political composition, the registrations. Is it even possible to get to a situation where these are balanced in some manner? This is number one. Number two is that we are setting these things now, right? In the future, it may be the case that at every election, before every election, there may be a push or desire to tweak them in some way. How are there some precautions in place so that this time it doesn't turn into some type of gerrymandering type of situation?
Maybe Bill, if you're there, you can speak to what is the demographical criteria that the counties can use? And maybe if there are some criteria that shouldn't be used. I think David did show the maps that show some of the demographical breakdowns, but you may not have seen those. They are in the presentation. But getting to the political ones, I don't think that is, and I think there might be a reason why. Is Bill there?
Yeah, I couldn't quite understand the question. Was the question about what type of demographic data can be used for?
It was specifically, we've got some of the demographical breakdown in the presentation. The gentleman just wasn't here when we covered that slide.
Mhm.
So he can look at that at a different time, but he asked a specific question about the political affiliations in the trustee areas, and if there was any consideration of balancing political affiliation. Did I get that right?
How we start changing every election?
Right, and maybe just briefly, you can speak to what would trigger a redevelopment of the maps. I mean, I know what the answer is, but maybe you can share it.
Yeah, so I'll address that one first. So as far as the any sort of redistricting of the maps, that's what you see local agencies that currently have these types of elections doing right now. That's triggered by the census. So in this case, the board, these maps would be in place until 2030, well, actually 2031. When the census data was released, then the board would need to go back and look at whether or not the maps are still population balanced or not. So for the most part, the maps stay in place for 10 years because the population data won't change officially for 10 years. As far as the demographics, you know, as the superintendent mentioned on I think on the earlier slide, we talk about the ethnic and racial background or demographics that the courts require us to take a look at and make sure that that's satisfactory, which it is in this case. As far as, you know, partisan data, given that school board elections are nonpartisan, that's not something that I've seen really any local agency or local education agency look at in drawing maps, because it's effectively not relevant to school district elections. So that's not something usually, I don't know if David, in your experience, but that's not something I've seen used at all.
Yeah, I haven't seen that either.
David, could you real quickly step back to one of the demographical slides just so we can see a representation of what to look for?
So the first, this is the actual overall population of these 5 areas. And for each proposed trustee area, the breakdown of the racial breakdowns here. So these are the actual counts of the total population. And the next slides following each one of these is the citizen voting age population with the estimates there with the racial breakdown as well. So those are the two main demographic criteria that we're allowed to look at. And that's required to be vetted through the attorney.
Great, thank you. And so you can download the presentation from the website, the district's website. You'll have access to all that data. Are there any other questions?
Just a quick one.
This question, is the data actually available at all for you to look at the Artisan data, is that accessible to you, but you just never used it when you created media scenarios?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So you have the racial data and that was taken into consideration when you did the mapping. But the political affiliation data, is that even available? So it's not available to you, there's no data for that.
Not by census blocks data, no, and again, it's not, it's just not available, it's not a requirement, it's not that I know of, no, not that I've seen.
That's fair. Just a general question. In the final step, where would it be just 2 maps that would be allowed to be the final set of maps for election, or
The board will select one.
will select one?
The goal, let me get my question, the goal is to bring all 4 maps to the board on the 10th. And they will have a conversation about the maps, and hopefully we'll be able to narrow the number of maps down. And then on the 24th, they will select a single map that will then get sent through the county process. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, David. I thank all the participants, both on Zoom and in person. And this is one of our first, I think I would say, first and successful Zoom in-person meetings. I'm hopeful that we got the sound system to work, the audio, the video. Our consultants were able to come in from the various parts of the state and the county that they reside in. So I think it worked really well, and hopefully there'll be a model we can move forward with.
If I can, it looks like actually speaking of technology, it looks like we did get one last question in the chat. Actually, I'm not sure. And the question was, I'll just go ahead and read. Where can I access the current trustee area map? It'd be helpful for me to understand what's changing in the proposed scenario. So just a point of clarification, the process the district is going through right now is actually moving from at-large elections where there are no current trustee areas to a system where we do have trustee areas. So in a sense, all the trustee areas are new. It's different than what you see some local agencies doing that are redistricting. This is sort of the initial districting process. So, and I think there's more information, I think just shared in the chat as far as the process and where the district is. So just wanted to make sure we address that.
No, thank you for catching that. And so that link that we both, a couple people dropped in there, that'll take you to the main webpage. It has the interactive map and it has the ability to put comments in, and that comes to our communications director, and that then gets distributed to staff. And so again, I'd invite all those that participated to send in their comments so that we can fine tune this as we kind of head towards the finish line. Again, I appreciate everyone's attending this, and thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
You said nobody was really coming around.
Oh, it worked out really good.
I really don't think so. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
thank you.
Thank you.